The morning sun cast long shadows across the police department's brick walls as the new police chief adjusted his badge in the mirror. 20 years of memories flashed through his mind, from his first day as a rookie patrol officer to this moment. He wasn't just any police chief, he was the first black police chief in Riverside's 127-year history. Getting here hadn't been easy. Growing up on the city's east side, he'd seen firsthand how the relationship between police and the community could go wrong. But instead of letting that push him away from law enforcement, it pulled him toward it. He wanted to be the change he wished to see. "Your coffee, Chief," said Officer Chen, placing a steaming cup on his desk. The chief smiled, remembering his own days bringing coffee to his superiors. Now, sitting in this office with its dark wood panels and view of the city park, he couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. His path to becoming chief was paved with small victories and tough lessons. There was the time he started a youth basketball program, bringing cops and kids together every Saturday morning. Then there was the domestic violence unit he built from scratch, which became a model for other departments across the state. Each step forward came with its own challenges, but he faced them all with a steady hand and an open mind. The chief picked up the framed photo on his desk, a black and white shot of his grandfather in his World War II uniform. "Look at us now, Grandpa," he whispered. His grandfather had been a porter on the railways when many jobs were closed to black men. Now his grandson was running an entire police department. 6 months into his role as chief, he'd already made waves. He implemented body camera requirements that went beyond state standards. He started community feedback sessions where residents could speak directly with command staff. He even revamped the training program to focus more on de-escalation and cultural awareness. But not everyone welcomed the changes. He could feel the resistance from some of the old guard, the ones who muttered politics under their breath when he walked by. They saw his reforms as an attack on traditional policing, but he saw them as necessary steps toward building trust. The morning news played quietly on the office TV, another story about police reform debates nationwide. The chief sighed, knowing that change never came easy. His phone buzzed with text messages from community leaders, other chiefs, and officers needing guidance. Everyone wanted to know how he was going to make things different. In the bullpen outside his office, he could hear the daily buzz of police work, radio calls, typing on keyboards, officers discussing cases. It was the soundtrack of a department in motion, and now he was conducting the orchestra. Every decision he made would ripple through not just the department, but the entire community. As he reviewed the morning reports, he thought about the promise he'd made during his swearing-in ceremony. "We will build bridges where there are walls," he'd said. "We will listen where there has been silence. And we will serve with honor, dignity, and respect for all." Those weren't just pretty words for the cameras, they were his blueprint for change. Little did he know, his biggest test was about to walk through the door. In a few hours, a routine traffic stop would escalate into a situation that would challenge everything he stood for. It would either break his department apart or become the catalyst for real change. But for now, he took another sip of coffee, reviewed his emails, and prepared for what he thought would be just another day serving the city he loved. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and more officers filtered into the station. Each one who passed his office window gave a respectful nod. They might not all support his methods, but they couldn't deny his dedication to the job. After all, he'd worked alongside many of them, shared meals with them, celebrated their victories, and mourned their losses. The chief stood up and walked to the window, watching the city come to life. School buses rolled by, shop owners raised their shutters, and early morning joggers circled the park. This was his city, his community, and he was determined to make it better for everyone, even if that meant facing the tough conversations that lay ahead. The afternoon sun beat down on the police station's parking lot as the chief's phone lit up with urgent messages. What started as a quiet Tuesday was about to turn into one of the most challenging days of his career. A senior officer had just radioed in a routine traffic stop, but something in the dispatcher's voice made the chief's instincts kick in. He pulled up the live feed from the officer's dashboard camera on his computer screen. The footage showed a sleek silver sedan with a broken taillight pulled over on Oak Street near the university. The young man behind the wheel was wearing a university sweatshirt, his student parking permit visible in the corner of his windshield. Everything about this should have been routine. But it wasn't. The chief watched as the veteran officer approached the car, his body language already tense. 25 years of police experience had taught the chief to read these situations like a book. The young driver was doing everything right. Hands visible on the steering wheel, registration and insurance ready, speaking respectfully. Yet something was off about the officer's approach. Then it happened. The officer's body camera captured every word, every gesture, every moment of what was quickly becoming a nightmare scenario. The chief's hands tightened on his desk as he heard the officer's tone shift from professional to hostile. Words spilled out that had no place in modern policing, comments about the student's race that made the chief's stomach turn. The young man, remarkably, kept his composure. His phone was propped on the dashboard, quietly recording everything. Smart move, the chief thought. The student's voice remained steady, even as the officer's words grew more aggressive. "Sir, I don't understand why you're upset. I'm just trying to cooperate," the student said, his hands still visible on the wheel. In the background, other cars slowed down to watch. Pedestrians stopped on the sidewalk, phones raised. The chief could see this situation spinning out of control in a dozen different ways, each ending worse than the last. He reached for his radio, then stopped. This needed more than just an intervention. It needed to become a turning point. The footage continued to roll as backup officers arrived on scene. They'd been called by the original officer, who claimed the student was being uncooperative. The chief watched as the younger officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with their senior colleague's behavior. One of them stepped forward, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Chief," his assistant called from the doorway, "the video's already hitting social media." Of course it was. In today's world, incidents like these didn't stay quiet for long. He could already imagine the headlines, the protests, the division this would cause in the community he'd worked so hard to unite. The student was eventually let go with a warning about the taillight, but the damage was done. The chief sat back in his chair, the weight of what he'd just witnessed settling heavily on his shoulders. The officer's personnel file was already open on his desk, decades of service, dozens of commendations, and now this. In the hallway, he could hear whispered conversations, officers trying to make sense of what had happened. Some defended their colleague, others expressed disgust. The department was already starting to fracture along invisible lines. The chief knew his next steps would either heal these divisions or deepen them permanently. His phone buzzed again, the mayor this time. News traveled fast in a city like this, but the chief wasn't ready to make any statements yet. He needed to handle this differently. The easy path would be to fire the officer immediately, make a public statement condemning his actions, and hope the community would accept it as enough. But something told him there was more to this story. 23 years on the force doesn't turn toxic overnight. As he reviewed the footage one more time, he noticed something in the officer's eyes when he realized he was being recorded, not just anger, but fear. Fear of what? The chief wondered. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across his office. The normal end-of-shift bustle filtered through his door, but nothing about this day was normal anymore. Tomorrow, this would be all over the news. People would demand action. His own officers would look to him for leadership. The community would watch his every move. As he stood to put on his jacket, the chief made a decision. This incident wouldn't just be another statistic, another example of what's wrong with policing. He would turn it into something else entirely, but first, he needed to have a very difficult conversation with a veteran officer who'd lost his way. Early morning light crept through the blinds of the chief's office as he prepared for what might be the most important conversation of his career. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, untouched. He'd spent the night reviewing the officer's file again and again, looking for clues he might have missed, trying to understand how they'd reached this point. The station was quieter than usual. Word had spread about yesterday's incident, and everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells. The chief could feel the weight of their expectations, some hoping he'd make an example of the veteran officer, others praying he'd find a way to smooth things over. A knock on the door broke the silence. "He's here, sir," his assistant said softly. The chief nodded, straightening his uniform one last time. He'd chosen to wear it today instead of his usual suit, a reminder of the bonds they shared as officers sworn to protect and serve. The veteran officer stepped into the office, his face a mask of defiance. 23 years of service showed in the slight gray at his temples and the creases around his eyes. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge gleaming, everything by the book except for what mattered most. "Sit down," the chief said, his voice calm but firm. The officer took the chair across from the desk, his posture rigid. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Through the window, life went on as usual in the city they'd both sworn to protect, unaware of the drama unfolding in this small office. "I watched that footage at least 20 times last night," the chief began, his fingers laced together on the desk. "And each time, I asked myself the same question. How does an officer with your experience, your record of service, end up here?" The veteran officer shifted in his seat but remained silent. The chief could see the muscle working in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands that he tried to hide by clenching them in his lap. 23 years, the chief continued, letting the words hang in the air. "That's longer than that young man you pulled over has been alive. You've trained rookies who are now senior officers. You've saved lives. You've earned every commendation in your file. And yesterday, you threw all of that away over a broken taillight." Something flickered across the officer's face. Anger, shame, or maybe both. The chief leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "I'm not sitting here as your superior officer right now. I'm sitting here as someone who's walked the same streets you have, faced the same dangers, made the same sacrifices." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the muffled sounds of the station beyond the door. The chief stood up, walking to the window. "You know what I see out there? I see a city that's trying to heal. I see communities that want to trust us again. And then I watch that video, and I see all of that trust crumbling away, one word at a time." He turned back to face the officer. "I could fire you right now. It would be the easy choice. The public would applaud it, the mayor would back me, and we'd all move on. But something tells me there's more to this story." The veteran officer's facade cracked slightly, his shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. The chief noticed. He'd been trained to notice such details, to read people in moments of crisis. "So here's what's going to happen," the chief continued, returning to his chair. "You're going to talk to me. Not as your boss, not as the chief, but as someone who needs to understand how one of his best officers ended up on that video. Because right now, you've got two choices. You can walk out that door and turn in your badge, or you can help me understand what's really going on." The office fell silent again, but this time it was different. The tension had shifted from hostile to expectant. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a reminder that the world wouldn't stop turning while they had this conversation. The veteran officer looked up, meeting the chief's gaze for the first time since he'd entered the office. His eyes were red-rimmed, his expression no longer defiant but haunted. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of truth. "Chief," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I need to tell you something, and it's not going to be easy to hear." The chief leaned back in his chair, ready to listen. Sometimes, he knew, the hardest conversations were the ones that needed to happen most. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, two men in uniform prepared to have the kind of honest discussion that could either break them apart or build something new from the pieces. The veteran officer's hands trembled as he reached for the phone in his pocket. The morning light streaming through the office windows had grown stronger, but his face looked older, more worn than it had just moments ago. He pulled up a photo and placed the phone on the chief's desk, screen up. "That's my son's wedding," he said quietly. 3 months ago." The chief leaned forward to look. The photo showed a happy couple on their wedding day, the officer's son in a sharp tuxedo, beaming beside his beautiful bride, a young black woman in a stunning white dress. Their joy was radiant, infectious, impossible to miss. "I didn't go to the wedding," the officer continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I told them I was working. Truth is, I couldn't handle it. My own son, he traveled off, staring at his hands." The chief sat back, understanding beginning to dawn. The pieces were starting to fit together. The timing of the officer's recent behavior changes, the increasing tension in his interactions, the underlying current of fear in his anger during the traffic stop. "How long have they been together?" the chief asked gently. 4 years. I kept thinking it was just a phase, you know? That he'd eventually. The officer shook his head, disgust crossing his face, but this time it was directed at himself. I was raised certain ways, taught certain things. My father, his father before him, it was just how things were. He looked up at the chief, his eyes red. Then my son brings home this amazing young woman. She's a pediatric nurse, works with sick kids, smart as a whip. Makes my boy happier than I've ever seen him. And all I could think about were the things my daddy would say. The silence in the office felt different now, heavy with shared understanding. Outside, the usual sounds of the station continued. Phones ringing, officers talking, life going on. But in here, something was shifting, breaking down, rebuilding. The first time they came to dinner, I could barely look at her, the officer continued. My wife was so ashamed of me. She told me I was going to lose our son if I didn't change. But how do you change something that's been part of you for so long? He picked up his phone again, swiping to another photo, this one of him holding his first grandchild, born just a month ago. My granddaughter, he said, his voice cracking. She's perfect. Absolutely perfect. And when I hold her, I don't see color. I just see love. The chief watched as tears finally broke through the officer's tough exterior. But then I put on this uniform and go out there, and all those old thoughts come rushing back. It's like I'm at war with myself. That kid yesterday, he could have been my son-in-law. And the things I said. He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of his actions, the shame of his words, seemed to physically bend him forward in his chair. The morning sun caught the tears on his cheeks, making them shine. Yesterday wasn't about that young man's broken taillight, was it? The chief asked quietly. It was about your broken heart. The officer nodded slowly. I look at my granddaughter, and I see the future. Then I look in the mirror, and I see the past. I don't know how to bridge that gap. Every time I try, I just get angry. At myself, at the world, at how everything's changing. The chief stood up and walked to his office window, looking out at the city they'd both served. People of all backgrounds walked the streets below, living their lives, building their futures. He turned back to the officer. Change isn't easy, he said, but it's necessary, and it's never too late to start. The officer looked up, hope mixing with the shame in his eyes. I want to be better, he whispered, for my granddaughter, for my son, for myself. I just don't know how. The chief returned to his desk, picking up the phone with the wedding photo. He studied it for a moment, the joy, the love, the promise of a better future. When he spoke again, his voice was firm but kind. Then let's figure it out together, he said, because that's what family does. And in this department, we're family. The morning sun had reached its full strength now, filling the office with light. As the two men began to talk, really talk, about fear, about change, about growth, something new was taking root. It wasn't just about saving one officer's career anymore. It was about saving his soul, and maybe in the process, showing others that change was possible, no matter how deeply rooted the past might be. The first day back was the hardest. The veteran officer stood in front of the community center, his palms sweaty against his uniform. Inside, a group of teenagers waited for their new police mentor. The chief had been clear. If he wanted to keep his badge, he needed to see his community through new eyes. You don't have to say much, the community coordinator told him kindly. Just listen, that's all we ask. Her warm smile reminded him of his daughter-in-law, and something in his chest loosened slightly. The teens sat in a circle, some slouching, others sitting straight, all watching him with varying degrees of skepticism. He took a deep breath and did something he'd never done before. He told them the truth. About his mistakes, his fears, his granddaughter, and his desire to change. One boy in the back uncrossed his arms. A girl in the front row leaned forward. By the end of the session, they were asking questions, real questions, not just the polite ones they'd prepared. Did you really admit all that to the chief? One asked. Weren't you scared? Terrified, he answered honestly. But sometimes being scared is part of doing what's right. Weeks passed. The chief's plan was comprehensive. Community outreach was just the beginning. The officer found himself paired with different partners on patrol, officers whose experiences were vastly different from his own. His first partner was a young officer who'd grown up in the same neighborhoods where they now patrolled. See that corner store? His partner pointed out one day. When I was a kid, just walking in there meant being followed around like a potential thief. That's what we're trying to change. The veteran officer thought about his granddaughter, wondering if someone would ever follow her around a store. The thought made his stomach turn. Cultural sensitivity training wasn't just sitting in a classroom anymore. The chief had arranged for real conversations with community leaders, family dinners with local residents, and ride-alongs with civilians who wanted to share their perspectives. One evening, he found himself sitting in a living room, eating homemade cookies with a family who'd lived in the city for 3 generations. Their youngest son was the same age as the college student he'd pulled over that fateful day. "Tell us about your family," the mother asked, passing him another cookie. So he did. He showed them pictures of his granddaughter, and they showed him pictures of their children. Somewhere between the cookies and the coffee, he realized they were all just people trying to build better lives for their families. The hardest moment came when he had to face his own son and daughter-in-law. The chief had suggested family counseling as part of the process. Sitting in that office, watching his son hold his wife's hand, the officer finally found the words he'd been struggling to say. "I was wrong," he told them, his voice shaking. "I was so wrong, and I'm so sorry. When I look at my granddaughter, I see pure love. And that's what I should have seen all along, in both of you." His daughter-in-law's tears and tight hug told him more than words ever could about the power of change and forgiveness. Back at the station, other officers watched his transformation with mixed reactions. Some were skeptical, others curious. The chief had made it clear. This wasn't just about one officer's journey, but about creating a template for real change. During briefings, the veteran officer started sharing his experiences. "I thought I knew everything after 23 years on the force," he'd tell them. "Turns out I had the most important lessons still to learn." The teens from the community center started waving when they saw him on patrol. Store owners who'd once watched him warily now offered friendly nods. His partner noticed he'd stopped tensing up in certain neighborhoods, stopped making assumptions about the people they encountered. One rainy afternoon, they got a call about a broken taillight. The driver was a young black man, nervous behind the wheel. The veteran officer approached the car, remembering his own actions months ago. This time, he smiled, explained the issue clearly, and offered directions to a reliable mechanic nearby. As they drove away, his partner glanced over. "That was different," he said simply. "I'm different," the officer replied, watching the rain wash the streets clean. That evening, as he prepared to end his shift, he found a note on his desk. It was from the chief, short but meaningful. "Progress isn't about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them. Keep going." He tucked the note into his pocket, next to the latest photo of his granddaughter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that people could change. But for the first time in his career, he felt truly worthy of the badge he wore, not because he was perfect, but because he was finally willing to learn, to grow, and to see the humanity in every face he encountered. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The autumn leaves were turning golden outside the police academy as the veteran officer adjusted his collar. He wasn't here to make an arrest or file a report. He was here to teach. "You sure you're ready for this?" the chief asked, standing beside him in the hallway. Through the door, they could hear the murmur of voices, new recruits waiting for their afternoon training session on community relations. "No," the officer admitted with a small smile. "But that's kind of the point, isn't it?" Inside the classroom, 30 fresh faces looked up at him. Some he recognized from the community center, local kids who decided to join the force, inspired by the changes they'd seen. Others were from out of town, drawn by the department's growing reputation for innovative policing. "I'm not here to tell you how to be perfect officers," he began, his voice steady. "I'm here to tell you about the biggest mistake of my career and how it changed everything." The room fell silent. He pulled up the dashboard camera footage from that day, still hard to watch even now. But this time, there was something different playing alongside it, cell phone footage from the young student he'd pulled over. "Two perspectives of the same moment," he explained. "Both true, both important, and both teaching us something different." As the videos played, he talked about fear, not just the kind that makes officers reach for their weapons, but the deeper kind that makes people build walls around their hearts. He shared stories about his granddaughter, about family dinners that now included both his children and the teenagers from the community center. "Yesterday," he told them, "my granddaughter had her first birthday party. Look around this room." The people who came to celebrate represented every color, every background you can imagine. And you know what? She loved every single one of them. Babies don't learn hate, we teach it to them. And what we can teach, we can unteach. A hand went up in the back. But how do you deal with the prejudices you grew up with? One day at a time, he answered honestly. Every morning, I look in the mirror and remind myself that my granddaughter's future depends on the choices I make today. Sometimes I still catch those old thoughts trying to creep in. The difference is, now I recognize them for what they are, echoes of a past that has no place in our future. He clicked to the next slide. A photo of him and his new patrol partner teaching a community safety workshop. This job isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about building bridges. Sometimes those bridges have to start inside our own hearts. The chief, watching from the back of the room, noticed how the recruits leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't just another training session. This was real life, raw and honest. During the break, a young recruit approached the officer. "My dad's a lot like you were," she said quietly. "Any advice on how to talk to him?" The officer thought about his own journey, about the painful conversations and breakthrough moments. "Show him what change looks like," he said. "Sometimes people need to see it to believe it's possible." Back at the station later that day, he found a surprise waiting in the briefing room. The young man from the traffic stop, now a graduate student, had come to help teach the afternoon session. They'd met several times over the past months, carefully building a relationship that neither had thought possible. Ready to show them what real change looks like? The student asked, extending his hand. Together, they spent the afternoon sharing their story with veteran officers. They didn't sugarcoat the ugly parts, but they also highlighted the transformation that followed. Officers who'd been skeptical of the department's new direction started asking questions, sharing their own struggles and doubts. The hardest part, the officer told them, isn't admitting you were wrong. It's doing the work to make it right. That evening, as he walked up his car, he passed the wall of fallen officers, photos of those who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. He'd always seen it as a reminder of the dangers they faced. Now he saw something else, a reminder that change, while difficult, wasn't nearly as costly as staying the same. His phone buzzed with a text from his son. Another photo of his granddaughter, this time trying to walk. Below it, his son had written, "She's learning to move forward, just like her grandpa." The officer smiled, thinking about all the steps, big and small, that had brought him here. Tomorrow, he'd be back in the classroom, sharing his story with another group of recruits. The chief's gamble on redemption, rather than punishment, had paid off in ways no one could have predicted. As he drove home, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope. His granddaughter would grow up in a world that was far from perfect, but maybe, just maybe, it would be a little better because one old cop had learned it's never too late to change. 1 year after that life-changing traffic stop, the chief stood at a podium in the city hall, looking out at a packed room. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking steadily. But it wasn't just media filling the seats. There were officers, community members, and faces that told the story of a city coming together. "When I became chief," he began, his voice carrying through the hushed room, "I promised to transform our department. What I didn't expect was how that transformation would happen." He gestured to the veteran officer sitting in the front row, now a key figure in the department's new community relations unit. The past year had brought changes nobody could have predicted. What started as one officer's personal journey had sparked a movement within law enforcement that was spreading beyond their city limits. Police departments from across the country had been sending representatives to learn about their approach. "We didn't just write new policies," the chief continued. "We didn't just mandate more training. We did something much harder. We learned to see each other as human beings first." In the audience, familiar faces nodded. There was the student from the traffic stop, now running a program that brought police officers and college students together for monthly dialogue sessions. The teenagers from the community center sat with their families, wearing t-shirts from the youth leadership program they'd helped design. The veteran officer's family was there too, his son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter, now walking and curious about everything. She waved at everyone from her mother's lap, unaware that her very existence had helped change hearts and minds. Last month, the chief shared, our department responded to over 3,000 calls. Not a single one escalated into a confrontation. Our complaint rates have dropped by 60%. But numbers don't tell the whole story. He clicked to the next slide. A series of photographs showing the changes in their community. Officers playing basketball with local kids. Community barbecues where badges and civilians mixed freely. Training sessions where veterans and rookies learned from each other and from the people they served. The real story, he continued, is about what happens when we choose understanding over anger, growth over punishment, and hope over fear. The veteran officer stood up next, walking to the podium. His hands no longer shook when he spoke in public. He'd done it so often over the past year, sharing his story with anyone who wanted to learn from it. A year ago, he said, I was a problem that needed solving. Today, I'm part of the solution. But the real heroes aren't standing on this stage. They're sitting in this room, every person who chose to give me a chance to learn and grow. He told them about the changes spreading through other departments, how officers who'd been stuck in old ways of thinking were starting to ask questions, seek help, admit their own struggles. The ripple effect had gone far beyond their city limits. The young student who'd been pulled over that day stood up next. Together with the officer, they'd developed a training program that was now being adopted by police academies across the state. It wasn't just about cultural sensitivity, it was about real understanding, personal growth, and the courage to change. What happened that day could have ended my trust in law enforcement forever, the student said. Instead, it showed me that real change is possible, even in the places where we least expect it. As the presentation continued, the chief watched the faces in the crowd. He saw hope there, and something even more important, belief. Belief that things could be different. Belief that one person's transformation could lead to many more. The community coordinator from the center stood to share her perspective. When he first walked into our center, she said, the teens were skeptical. Now they see him as proof that people can change. That's worth more than any policy or procedure. Near the end of the event, the veteran officer's granddaughter broke free from her mother's arms and toppled across the stage. The audience laughed as she grabbed her grandfather's leg, looking up at him with complete trust and love. The chief watched as the officer scooped her up, this little girl who had no idea she helped change an entire department. This, the officer said, holding her close, this is what we're really doing here. We're building a future where she won't have to be afraid of the police or of anyone else. As the event wound down, people lingered, sharing stories and making plans. The chief overheard snippets of conversation, officers talking about starting similar programs in their own departments, community members offering to help, young people asking how they could get involved. The sun was setting as they finally left City Hall, casting long shadows across the steps. But unlike the shadows of the past, these were full of promise. The chief watched as his officers mixed with the crowd, no longer separated by invisible barriers of fear and mistrust. Ready for what comes next? He asked the veteran officer as they walked to their cars. The officer looked at his granddaughter, sound asleep in her mother's arms, then back at the chief. As long as we keep moving forward, he said, I'm ready for anything.